In 1977, a black pastor from a quiet Arkansas town vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers and unanswered prayers. For 25 years, his disappearance remained a mystery. That is, until a logger, clearing a remote part of the forest, stumbled upon something strange, buried beneath an old tree stump, something that was clearly never meant to be found. Now 42, Marcus Freeman sat alone in his modest apartment near the Ozark Mountains early Friday morning. The soft hum of the television filled the silence as he absently flipped through channels. It was too early for real programming, just static faces and faded talk shows until he landed on a religious broadcast. A preacher's voice echoed from stained glass windows while hymns played gently in the background. Marcus froze. The voice, the setting, the emotion, it all reminded him of his father, Reverend Elijah Freeman, whose sermons once brought the same kind of comfort. But that was before he disappeared. Help me with a like and a subscribe to motivate me to make better videos. And don't forget to comment which country you are from. That ache, buried but never healed, returned like a cold wind through a broken window. Marcus turned away, unable to bear the memory. Just then, the phone rang. Curious, he walked into the kitchen and picked it up. What he heard made his heart skip. Mr. Freeman, this is Detective Sarah Miller. We found something related to your father's case. Marcus gripped the phone tighter, a frown crossing his face. Is this a joke? That case is ancient history. But Detective Miller's voice remained calm. No, sir. A logger found a vintage Adidas bag. Buried in the woods inside was a pastoral robe and a Bible with your father's name written in it. The room went still. A Bible with his father's name. We'd like you to come identify the items. Officers are en route to pick you up if that's all right. Yes, Marcus said, his voice low but steady. I'll be ready. He quickly dressed, mind racing. Before stepping out, he paused to glance back at the still playing church program. Just minutes ago, he had turned his back on faith, but something about this moment made him feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone. The police car ride was quiet as they left town, heading into increasingly dense forest. About 15 minutes in, they stopped at a scene surrounded by yellow tape and crawling with activity. Officers and workers moved around the area where a giant stump had been unearthed. Detective Miller, a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and a calm presence, greeted him. Mr. Freeman, this is Tom Jenkins, the logger who discovered the bag. Tom, rugged and apologetic, stepped forward and shook Marcus's hand. Wish we were meeting under better circumstances. He explained how he and his colleague had been clearing brush when they noticed something odd about the stump. We dug by hand too deep in for machinery and found the bag buried under the roots. When I saw the Bible and robe, I knew something was off. Marcus stepped toward the evidence, his eyes locking onto the worn Adidas bag resting by the tree. It felt surreal. How did this even get down there? The logger pointed out that the tree had likely been cut long ago, and whoever buried the bag had done so under the rotted stump, perhaps to keep it hidden forever. In a nearby tent, officers carefully unpacked the bag. The Bible was damp but intact. When they turned the front page, Marcus saw his father's handwriting, that familiar script from childhood devotionals. Then came a note tucked inside the last page. It looked like a daily prayer, but its tone was urgent, a plea asking God why there was so much evil, asking for strength to resist those trying to lead him away from faith. Marcus swallowed hard. That's definitely my father's handwriting. I remember every loop and curve. They pulled out the robe next. Though stained and aged, it was intact. Marcus ran his fingers over the fabric. It's his. The size, the color. I'm sure of it. Detective Miller nodded. We'll need to send it for DNA testing. Our facilities are limited out here, but we'll get answers. Marcus hesitated. Do you think someone did this to him? Buried this here on purpose? The detective examined the robe. No signs of blood or trauma. If someone murdered your father, we'd expect more evidence. It's also possible he chose to disappear to leave his life behind. Marcus shook his head. No. My father wouldn't run. And if he did want to vanish, why go so deep into the forest just to bury a bag? He looked back at the Adidas logo. He never even owned a bag like this. That wasn't who he was. Tom nodded. It would have taken serious effort to dig this deep, especially under a tree like this. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. Marcus stood there in silence, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. Whatever happened in those woods decades ago was no accident, and the truth, long buried, was finally clawing its way back into the light. It would have taken a lone man a great deal of time and effort to dig that deep and bury something so carefully, Marcus noted aloud. Detective Miller considered this thoughtfully. We'll keep that in mind, she said. Was there anyone in town or in your father's church who might have had something against him? Marcus let out a heavy sigh. This is the Ozarks. Back then, racial tensions were real, especially in a small religious town like our. My father was a faithful minister, never one to wrong others intentionally, but he definitely faced prejudice. The detective nodded. We'll re-examine the case files from the time. For now, we'll keep all options on the table. As officers secured the evidence, Marcus asked if they could send him photographs of what had been recovered. One officer explained that once processed, he'd receive digital copies of the documentation and images. Detective Miller gave him permission to return home and turn to speak with Tom Jenkins about the limitations now that the area had become an active investigation site. An officer escorted Marcus back to the car and drove him home. But instead of going inside when they arrived, Marcus walked straight to a spare room, his father's old study, which he'd lovingly recreated in his apartment after the family home had been sold. Though small, it was filled with his father's personal belongings, mostly books and sermon notebooks, all carefully preserved. He began scanning the shelves for his father's sermons. His father had been meticulous in keeping his notes organized by year, though the pages were now yellowed with age. Marcus was 15 when he first started studying these teachings under his father's guidance. Now at 42, he could only recall pieces of those lessons. He wanted to revisit them, not just to remember his father, but to remind himself that the man had been devout, steadfast, and far from someone who would simply give up on his faith or vanish willingly. As he gathered the volumes, he noticed something troubling. The year 1977, the year his father disappeared, was missing. He searched every shelf drawer and even checked inside his father's old bedroom furniture. But the 1977 volume wasn't there. Instead, in a cabinet near the bed, he found his father's personal diaries, but again none from 1977. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed. Why would the year his father vanished be the only one missing both the sermon notes and the diary entries? Could he have kept them at the church instead? Marcus remembered how upset he had been when he first moved all the items years ago. Maybe he had overlooked something. After tidying the room, he selected one of the older sermon notebooks for reference and headed to his car. He was going back to Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church for the first time in 25 years. The drive was short, just 10 minutes, but filled with memories. He remembered how powerful and moving his father's sermons had once been, how his voice could fill the room with both peace and fire. For the first time in decades, Marcus didn't fight the memory. He let it wash over him, feeling again the presence of the man who had raised him with integrity and faith. The church had aged since he last saw it. Once grand and vibrant, it now looked worn and tired. He drew a long breath and stepped inside. The interior was familiar. The polished wooden pews, stained glass windows, casting colorful reflections on the floor. The pulpit still standing with quiet dignity. As Marcus entered, he saw an elderly man near the altar. The man turned and smiled warmly. "May I help you, son?" "I hope so," Marcus replied. "I'm looking for someone who might have known my father." The man introduced himself as Pastor Harold Whitmore. Marcus instantly recognized the name. He'd seen him often as a boy. This was the man who had worked alongside his father. Though older, now there was no mistaking him. "I'm Marcus Freeman," he said. "Elijah Freeman's son." Pastor Harold's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with warmth. "Marcus, is it really you? We haven't seen you since my father disappeared." Marcus finished for him. "It's been 25 years. Harold nodded solemnly. "How have you been, son? We missed you around here. To be honest, my faith took a hit after what happened." "I'm still struggling," Marcus admitted. Just then, another elderly man entered from the back. Pastor Harold called out, "Reverend George Langston, look who's here." Reverend George, another long-time church servant, walked over with a smile of recognition. Both men were genuinely happy to see Marcus, but concerned when they heard what brought him back. Marcus explained about the discovery in the woods, the bag, the robe, the Bible, and how some now suspected his father may have taken his own life or abandoned the ministry. "I'm searching for the truth," Marcus said. "You both knew him. Do you really think he was the kind of man who would do that?" The two pastors exchanged uncertain glances. "Your father was a good man," Pastor Harold finally said. "Devoted, wise, kind. But no one can ever truly know the struggles inside a person's heart." Reverend George added quietly, "Why are you asking these questions now?" Harold asked. Marcus explained that with new evidence, the police had reopened the case. If they could find his body, maybe they could determine the cause of his death. With DNA and modern forensics, we could learn something definitive. Harold and George exchanged another look. "We never saw your father as someone troubled," Harold said slowly. "But in the final weeks, we noticed he spent a lot of late nights here in the church. He seemed burdened. When asked, he'd just say he was deep in prayer," George added. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's why I'm really here. I'm looking for the missing volume of his Sunday sermons from 1977. Marcus showed the pastors the old notebook he had brought from home. "This is what it should look like," he said. "My dad used the same kind of notebook for years. I have all of them except the one from 1977. That one's missing. His personal diary from that year is gone too." Pastor Harold and Reverend George examined the notebook thoughtfully. "We never saw these before," Harold said. "If we had, we'd have turned them over to you or the police back then." "Let's check anyway," George suggested. They made their way to the church office, which had once belonged to Reverend Elijah Freeman and was now used by George. They rummaged through the bookshelves and cabinets, then moved on to the library, combing through drawers, old shelves, and storage boxes. Nearly an hour passed with no sign of the missing volumes. Marcus, focused on the task, had set the notebook on the library table and forgotten about it. Despite their efforts, the search came up empty. "I appreciate your help," Marcus said with a tired smile. "Even if we didn't find anything." Before leaving, he knelt at one of the pews. It had been years since he prayed, and the words felt foreign in his mouth. But he bowed his head anyway. "If you're really there, Lord, if you rose from the dead, like they say, please help me find out what happened to my dad." Then he stood, turned and walked out of the church, unaware that his father's old sermon notebook still lay forgotten on the library table. Driving home, Marcus didn't realize he'd left it behind. His thoughts were clouded with the image of his father, sleepless, praying alone in the church, burdened by something Marcus still didn't understand. Then another memory struck his mother's death in 1976, just a year before his father vanished. The grief had been unbearable for both of them. Perhaps it had broken his father in ways Marcus never saw. Suddenly, Marcus turned his car in a different direction. Instead of going home, he drove to the cemetery just outside town where his mother was buried. On the way, he stopped at a small flower shop across the street from the cemetery. A kind-eyed woman wrapped the bouquet for him. "Special occasion?" she asked. "Just visiting my mother," Marcus replied. "It's been too long." The cemetery was peaceful beneath the late afternoon sun, shaded by old oak trees. Marcus walked slowly until he reached the familiar headstone, Sarah Freeman, beloved wife and mother. He gently placed the flowers before it and sat on the grass. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "It's been a while." He told her everything: the bag in the forest, the Bible, the visit to the church. Speaking aloud brought a strange comfort. "I don't know what happened to Dad," he admitted. "For years, I was angry at him, at God, at everything. But now, I just want the truth." As he sat in silence, he suddenly heard the soft sound of someone crying. He turned and saw a young boy, no more than 10, sitting against a tree a few rows away, his face streaked with tears. Marcus approached gently. "Hey there, are you okay?" The boy looked up startled. "What's your name?" Marcus asked. "Robbie," the boy whispered. "Robbie Hark." "Where are your parents?" Marcus asked. Robbie pointed toward a nearby grave. "Is someone here with you?" Marcus asked again. Robbie said nothing. "I can take you home if you'd like," Marcus offered. "Please." "Not home," Robbie said, his voice trembling. "They don't like me there. My aunt and uncle." Marcus's heart clenched. He remembered all too well what it felt like to be unwanted after his parents were gone. He had lived with relatives who made it clear he was a burden. "I understand," Marcus said softly. "I'll stay with you for a bit. But someone will come looking for you." As he placed a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder, he felt a wave of heat radiating through the boy's jacket. "Robbie, you've got a fever," Marcus said, alarmed. "You need to see a doctor. I can't just leave you here." "Please," the boy begged again. "Not home. Can you take me to your place?" "I wish I could, but I'd get in trouble," Marcus said. "How about the hospital?" Robbie looked terrified. "Can you take me to a church instead?" Marcus hesitated. "The hospital's better. They have medicine." "You need real help." Robbie's eyes welled up. "When my mom was alive, she'd go to church when I was sick. She'd get Holy Communion from the pastor and pray over me, and I'd feel better." Marcus took a deep breath. He knew the ritual well. His father had prepared communion for the sick dozens of times. "My dad was a pastor at Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church," Marcus told him. "He did that too. Here's what we'll do. If you come with me to the hospital, I'll go back to the church and get communion for you. We can take it together." "Deal." Robbie hesitated, then nodded. As they walked to the car, Marcus suddenly realized he hadn't seen the sermon notebook since the church. He remembered setting it on the library table and never picking it up. "I left the book," he muttered, but he'd have to deal with that later. First, the boy needed help. At the emergency room, Marcus explained the situation to the nurses. They weren't sure of Robbie's address, but said they could check records. Before Robbie was taken in, he turned to Marcus. "You promised about the communion." "I'll keep that promise," Marcus said, squeezing his hand. After completing paperwork and arranging to cover Robbie's treatment, Marcus stepped outside into the fading light. He pulled out his phone and found the church's number, one he had kept saved all these years. He called, but no one answered. Deciding not to wait, he drove straight to the church. Once inside, he searched for Pastor Harold or Reverend George, but neither was there. Instead, a young staff member greeted him. "Can I help you, sir?" the man asked politely. "I'm looking for Pastor Harold or Reverend George," Marcus replied. "Are they around?" The staffer shook his head. "They're at the church. They're at the cemetery right now performing blessings," the young staff member said. Marcus frowned. That didn't sound right. In all his years at Mount Olive, he'd never known the pastors to bless graves, especially not in the evening. "Is that normal?" he asked. The young man shrugged. "Sometimes they do that. It's been that way since I started here, but I can help you with something if you'd like." Marcus explained about the book he'd left behind in the library and the communion set he needed for a sick child in the hospital. "I was here earlier today," he said. "I spoke with Pastor Harold and Reverend George, but I left my book in the library. Also, I promised a boy I'd bring him a take-home communion." The staffer didn't seem suspicious or hesitant. "Sure thing. Let's check the library first." Together, they walked back to the church library. Marcus let out a breath of relief when he saw the notebook still lying on the table, exactly where he had left it. He picked it up, noticing that someone had neatly reshelved the books they'd pulled out earlier during the search. As he looked around one last time, something caught his eye. One book on the top shelf was slightly ajar, not aligned with the others. It looked like it had been disturbed recently. "I should fix that before it falls and hurt someone," Marcus said. The young staff member began to object, saying he could handle it later, but Marcus was already reaching up. He was tall enough to grab it without much trouble, but the book was unexpectedly heavy. It slipped from his fingers and dropped with a loud thud. "Sorry," Marcus muttered as he bent down to pick it up. The pages had splayed open across the floor. He glanced at the cover, Church Financial Management and Stewardship. Not an exciting title, but what caught his attention was the handwriting scribbled in the margins, his father's handwriting. "Is this book available to borrow?" Marcus asked, trying to sound casual. The staff member hesitated. "We'd need to check it out in the library's log, but yeah, it should be fine." "Great." After logging the loan, the staff member left briefly to retrieve the communion set from the sacristy. "May I come with you?" Marcus asked. "I, I used to help in the sacristy when my father served here. The young man offered an apologetic smile. I've heard stories about Reverend Elijah Freeman. But no one's allowed in the sacristy unless you're authorized. Marcus nodded in understanding. Of course. While he waited in the hallway, Marcus opened the book. His father's writing ran through the pages, highlighted passages, underlined phrases. One quote stood out. God sees how we handle his money. This isn't just bookkeeping, it's about trust and integrity. In the margin, his father had written, accountability to God first, then to the congregation. Marcus kept reading and suddenly noticed faint, almost invisible indentations on a page. His father had always pressed hard when writing in pencil. Tilting the page toward the light, Marcus saw two names, faintly circled: Harold Whitmore and George Langston, each followed by a question mark. Several sentences nearby were underlined passages about financial impropriety in church leadership and the biblical importance of addressing it with grace but firmness. Marcus's stomach turned. Had his father suspected something? Was this why the 1977 notebook and diary were missing? From a nearby window, Marcus noticed two figures in the cemetery, likely Pastor Harold and Reverend George. Their shapes moved slowly in the dim light. The staffer returned, handing Marcus a small cloth bag. "Here's the communion, sir." Marcus took it gratefully. "Thank you. By the way, do you know exactly what they're doing out there?" He gestured toward the cemetery. The staff member looked out. "Just blessing graves, like I said. I was in the cellar earlier cleaning, so I'm not sure when they started." Marcus thanked him again and stepped outside. He had his father's notebook, the borrowed book, and the communion, but something didn't sit right. As he made his way toward the car, he stopped. No. He needed to talk to them again. He wanted to thank them and watch their reactions more closely. He crossed the small grassy field that separated the church from the cemetery. As he neared, the fading light allowed him to see better. Reverend George was shoveling dirt onto a mound while Pastor Harold stood nearby, holding what looked like a bag. They hadn't noticed him. "Good evening," Marcus called, deliberately announcing himself. Both men jumped, startled. Their faces twisted in surprise and alarm. Marcus, Pastor Harold's voice was unnaturally high. "What are you doing back here?" "Sorry for the surprise," Marcus replied calmly, walking closer. "I came back to get my book from the library and the communion I promised a sick boy at the hospital." He glanced at the shovel and disturbed soil. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" The two men exchanged a quick look. Pastor Harold opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. Reverend George jumped in. "We were blessing the graveyard. Then we noticed an old pet grave, someone's dog long buried here." Pastor Harold nodded rapidly. "Yes, and the owner gave us permission to relocate it. The cemetery is getting full. We needed to make room." Marcus looked at the fresh mound of dirt, then back at the bag in Harold's hand. A dog's grave. In the fading light, at this hour, it sounded absurd, but he said nothing. "I see. Sorry to disturb you. I just wanted to let you know I came back." Pastor Harold's gaze dropped to the book under Marcus's arm. Is that another book from the library? Marcus nodded. Yes. It fell off the top shelf. I noticed my father's handwriting inside. I borrowed it with permission. Reverend George's expression tightened. Your father was interested in that book too. Just be sure to return it on Sunday. Of course, Marcus said. I should be going. I promised the boy I'd bring him communion. He turned and began walking back to his car, feeling their eyes burning into his back. As he opened the door and slid behind the wheel, he looked through the windshield. Harold and George were still standing there close together, deep in conversation. Their posture was tense, their gestures animated, nothing like the relaxed body language of two men performing routine cemetery duties. Marcus started the engine, but his thoughts were already spinning. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. And whatever his father had uncovered back in 1977, it hadn't just disappeared. It had been buried. Marcus started the engine but didn't drive off. He couldn't stop watching them. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. As he prepared to leave, his phone rang. It was the hospital. Mr. Freeman, this is Nurse Jenkins from County General. The boy you brought in, Robbie, he's asking for you. His family's arrived too. Thank you, Marcus replied. Please let him know I'm on my way. But just as he shifted into gear, he spotted movement in the cemetery. Reverend George was loading the shovel and the same bag into the back of his car, parked beneath a street light on the far side. Without a glance around, he climbed into his vehicle and sped away, exiting through a side access road. A moment later, Pastor Harold slipped back into the church through the rear door. Marcus hesitated. He should have gone straight to the hospital, but he couldn't shake what he'd just seen. Something in George's rushed movements felt deliberate. He turned out of the church lot and headed toward the hospital, but as he approached a red light near the main intersection, he saw the Reverend's car again. Reverend George raced through just as the light turned yellow, taking the road that led away from town and into the wilderness. That road led nowhere but forest cliffs and old scenic overlooks. Marcus's brow furrowed. What was he doing out there so late with a shovel and a suspicious bag? Making a split-second decision, Marcus turned and followed. He kept his headlights dimmed and stayed well back, his pulse accelerating. He hated delaying his promise to Robbie, but this felt bigger, maybe even connected to his father's disappearance. As the Reverend's car sped deeper into the forest, Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed Detective Miller. Detective, it's Marcus Freeman. Mr. Freeman, is everything all right? I'm not sure, he said, eyes fixed on the glowing tail lights ahead. I'm following Reverend George Langston from Mount Olive. I saw him digging in the cemetery. He claimed he was moving a dog's grave, but now he's speeding into the forest with a shovel and that same bag. Something feels wrong. There was a beat of silence before Detective Miller responded. Do not pursue him. Turn around. We'll handle it. I can't just let him go. Marcus argued. What if this has to do with my father? I won't engage him. I just need to know where he's going. "If you insist," she said firmly, "maintain a safe distance and do not get close. Keep the line open. Officers are 10 minutes behind you." "Understood." Marcus gripped the wheel tighter as the road narrowed and climbed into the hills. We're on Mountain View Road northeast, about 5 miles from town now. As he drove, he explained everything he'd discovered: the handwriting in the church book, the erased names, the annotations about financial misconduct, and the odd behavior of the church leaders. "Who erased my father's notes?" Marcus wondered aloud. "Who placed the book back on the shelf? They had to know I'd come back." The road began to climb sharply, winding into denser forest. "There's nothing out here but hiking trails and lookout points," Marcus said. "We're climbing now, almost to Eagle Point." Suddenly, the Reverend's brake lights flashed. His car pulled into a gravel lot beside a scenic overlook. "He's stopping," Marcus whispered. "Eagle Point lookout." "I'm parking 100 yards back out of sight." From his hidden spot, Marcus watched as Reverend George exited the car, put on a headlamp, and retrieved the bag and shovel. The older man made his way to the wooden stairs that descended to the lower trail, skirting the cliffside. "He's going down the cliff trail," Marcus said. "He's not just hiking, he's trying to get close to the edge. Probably to dispose of that bag." "Stay in your car," Detective Miller ordered. "Do not engage. Our units are close." But Marcus couldn't wait. The urgency gnawed at him. He had to know. He grabbed his flashlight, stepped into the cool night air, and made his way toward the trail, his footsteps silent against the gravel. He reached the top of the stairs and followed the bobbing headlamp down the steps to the lower platform. Reverend George Marcus called out, his voice firm but calm. The Reverend spun around, startled. His headlamp blinded Marcus for a moment. When the light shifted, Marcus could clearly see the shock and anger on the man's face. "What are you doing here?" George snapped. "Were you following me? I saw you leave the church and got worried," Marcus replied. "It's dangerous out here. What are you doing with that bag? You said it was just grave soil." The Reverend didn't respond. The only sound was the river rushing far below. After a pause, George's voice dropped. Don't you know what?" Marcus asked, still confused. "Don't pretend," George snapped. Then the sound of distant sirens sliced through the forest. The Reverend's eyes widened in alarm. "You called the police?" The bag slipped from his hands and hit the wooden trail with a heavy thud. Something inside made a solid noise, definitely not just soil. Taking advantage of his shock, Marcus lunged and grabbed the bag. He opened it. Inside, buried under grave dust, were 2 books, the missing 1977 sermon notebook and the personal diary, the very ones that had vanished from his father's study. Marcus stared at them, rage rising in his chest. "You hid these," he demanded. "You were going to throw them off the cliff." "Why?" George said nothing. "Those weren't dog remains in that cemetery, were they? They were my father's, weren't they?" Marcus said, his voice trembling with fury. You were going to throw his remains off this cliff into the river with everything else. Red and blue lights flashed across the darkened trees as police cars pulled into the overlook parking lot. Detective Miller's voice echoed from above. Police, stay where you are. Reverend George glanced back and forth, panicked. With a sudden frantic movement, he climbed over the wooden safety fence separating the trail from the cliff's deadly drop. No, Marcus yelled, dropping the bag and lunging forward. Don't do this. The Reverend's voice was low, broken. Better this than arrest and disgrace. He teetered on the edge, preparing to jump. Marcus reached for him, but missed. Then, just in time, 2 officers barreled down the stairs. They grabbed the Reverend's arms and dragged him back over the fence, despite his desperate struggles and pleas to be let go. You won't meet your God's judgment that easy, one officer said. You'll face the world's first. As George was pulled away, Detective Miller radioed for a second team to arrest Pastor Harold at the church, now suspecting his full involvement. Officers quickly secured the scene. The bag Marcus had dropped was collected and its contents logged into evidence. Reverend George, visibly shaken, was read his rights and placed into a patrol car. Detective Miller approached Marcus, who stood frozen in place, still catching his breath. I told you not to approach him. She said, her voice firm, but then she softened, seeing the shock on his face. But I understand why you did. We need you to come with us to the station to identify the items. Marcus nodded slowly, his hands still trembling. He would have thrown my father's remains off that cliff if I hadn't stopped him. He exhaled shakily. I have one favor. Could someone call the hospital and let them know I'll be late visiting the boy I promised I'd bring him communion? We'll make sure the nurse gets the message, Miller assured him. As they walked back to the cars, Marcus glanced once more at the cliffside. If he'd been even 5 minutes late, the truth might have been lost forever. At the police station, Marcus saw Reverend George being processed. To his surprise, Pastor Harold was already in custody, seated in a holding cell in handcuffs. Inside a quiet conference room, officers began laying out the recovered evidence: the 1977 sermon notebook, the personal diary, the church finance book Marcus had borrowed, the grave soil, now confirmed to contain bone fragments and part of a human skull, and the shovel. Marcus stared at the bones, a sick feeling settling in his stomach. Is that? We believe they're your father's remains, Detective Miller said gently. We'll confirm with DNA testing. Marcus managed a nod. What happens next? We need your statement, she replied, and confirmation that these items belong to your father. For the next hour, Marcus recounted everything: the morning call from the police, the confrontation at Eagle Point, the suspicious annotations in the finance book, the missing volumes, and the pastor's strange behavior. Forensic techs handled the evidence with extreme care. One technician brought over the diary. This suffered major damage, he explained. The leather covers rotted. Many pages are fused together into a pulpy block. Mold has destroyed much of it. Can any of it still be read? Miller asked. Some, the tech replied. Barely. But by some miracle, a few pages are still legible. They carefully opened a section, and Marcus leaned in. Faded ink, familiar strokes. It was his father's handwriting. I cannot ignore this any longer. The missing funds now exceed $10,000. When I confronted Harold and George, they denied everything, but the evidence is undeniable. I've prayed for guidance how to proceed without causing shame, but they must be held accountable. One officer murmured that this survived. It's extraordinary. Another added, and that the finance book just happened to be left accessible with erased notes feels like divine intervention. Honestly, they might have buried the books long after the body. Otherwise, they'd be dust. They turned to the sermon notebook, next much better preserved. Likely kept in a dry place for years, Miller said. Only recently did they decide to get rid of it. Inside were Sunday sermons from January to April 1977. The themes grew: intense honesty, redemption, moral courage. One sermon from early April was titled "The Courage to Confront Evil with Love," based on Matthew 15:15-17. Marcus read his father's notes. When we see wrongdoing, especially within the church, we are called to respond with truth and grace. Confront first in private, then with witnesses, then, if still unrepentant, before the congregation, not for punishment but restoration. The processing took hours. Late in the evening, an officer entered with an update. Pastor Harold is still denying most of the charges. But Reverend George broke. He's in tears. Said he deserves to die. The officer paused. He confessed. According to him, both he and Harold resented Reverend Elijah Freeman. Partly because of his race, this was rural Arkansas in the 70s, but mostly because he uncovered their embezzlement. Your father gave them an ultimatum: confess before the congregation and step down, or he'd expose them himself that Sunday. The room went silent. The officer's voice dropped. George said that Friday evening they confronted your father in the church basement. It got heated, and then they strangled him, wrapped him in an old robe from the sacristy, buried him in the woods. Marcus sat heavily in the chair, a wave of grief and vindication washing over him. After 25 years, the silence had finally broken, and the truth had come out of the grave. They buried him in the church cemetery, the officer said, but not in a marked grave. They desecrated an old pet grave, a dog that had once belonged to a congregation member, and buried your father underneath it in a shallow pit covered by tree roots. They hid him in plain sight, hoping he'd never be found. Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of the revelation crushing. They buried the body, the officer continued, but decided to separate and hide the evidence far away. They used that old Adidas sports bag to transport the robe, Bible, and other personal items. paid someone using church funds to dig a pit under a large tree stump deep in the forest. A tree that had been logged years earlier. That way they could locate it again if needed. The bag was buried and concealed beneath soil. Marcus's voice was a whisper. How did no one ever question this? The police, the community. Detective Miller sighed. They confessed to using their influence to stall the investigation, pushing the idea that your father left voluntarily. It was easy to misdirect. The town was divided, racially tense. Few wanted to believe otherwise. Over time, it faded into rumor and tragedy. She placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. The way you uncovered your father's remains, those books, the diary, it truly feels like divine intervention. Marcus looked down at the notebook lying open on the table. His father's words were still there about confronting evil with courage and compassion. Even in his final weeks, Elijah Freeman had tried to walk the path of integrity. What happens now? Marcus asked. They'll be charged, Miller said. Murder, obstruction, embezzlement. With George's confession and the evidence we've gathered, they'll likely spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Marcus nodded slowly. And my father, once the investigation is complete and DNA confirms it, you'll be able to give him a proper burial. Gratitude swelled in Marcus's chest, not joy, not yet, but relief, a long-awaited peace. His father's name would be cleared. No more whispers about abandonment. No more doubt. Divine intervention, he said softly, looking again at the items before him. Maybe so. After leaving the police station, Marcus drove to the hospital. The sky was dark now, and visiting hours had technically ended. But when he explained everything, the nurses made an exception. In Robbie's room, his aunt and uncle looked up from the bedside, visibly concerned. Mr. Freeman, the woman said, standing to greet him. Robbie told us what you did. Thank you for bringing him here. Marcus introduced himself. The uncle's brow furrowed. Freeman, as in Pastor Freeman. Marcus nodded. He was my father. Thought the name sounded familiar, the man said. That case. It was big news around here. People still talk about it. Robbie sat up, eyes brighter, now that the fever had broken. Where were you? He asked, voice stronger. I waited. Marcus smiled gently. I'm sorry I was late, Robbie. I had to help the police with something important. Are you a police officer? The boy asked wide-eyed. No, Marcus said. Just someone who ended up in the right place at the right time. He took out the communion set. Robbie's aunt raised a skeptical brow. There's no pastor here. Marcus met her eyes. I'm not a pastor. Not even close. But I believe God is present when we show up with open hearts. She softened. Marcus carefully opened the communion kit and placed the elements on the tray beside the bed. He spoke the familiar words his father once said from the pulpit, words he hadn't uttered in 25 years. He broke the bread, gave a piece to each of them, poured the juice, and handed out the small cups. In that quiet room, The act of communion took on new meaning. It wasn't about ritual, it was about remembrance, healing faith. Robbie looked up at him afterward. "Will I see you again?" Marcus nodded. "I think so. If you and your family want to visit Mount Olive sometime, I imagine they'll need some help rebuilding." Robbie smiled. "I want to be a kind man like you when I grow up." As Marcus left the hospital, he whispered a prayer of thanks, the first real prayer he'd spoken in decades. He confessed to resenting God for so long, but now he saw how every moment of the day had been guided from meeting a sick child in a cemetery to forgetting a notebook to stumbling upon the truth. None of it had been chance. It had been grace. He thought about the evil that had gone hidden for 25 years and how in the end, goodness had surfaced. The God his father had served so faithfully had never abandoned him. Justice had been delayed but not denied. Driving home beneath a sky glowing with stars, Marcus made silent plans. He would hold a proper funeral. He would stand before the congregation and share the truth. He would tell them what his father had stood for and how, even in death, that truth had found its way back. And maybe, just maybe, he'd find his way back to faith, not in spite of what had happened, but because of the integrity his father had shown. As he pulled into his driveway, Marcus looked up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on you." After 25 years of doubt, anger, and silence, Marcus Freeman had finally found peace. The truth had risen from the grave, justice would be served, and faith unexpected and unshaken had been restored. Thank you for choosing my video among thousands of videos out there to watch. Helping me with a subscription of yours is very small but very big and too valuable.